Hi, this is my review of Era the Empowered, Volume 1. This volume contains 3 comic books: Lacuna Revelation, Blue Shift Frenemies, and Violet Unstoppable. This is based on the universe of the Era the Empowered role-playing game. If you haven't seen my review of that role-playing game, I'm going to put some links in the description below so that you can check out the core rulebook and some pieces of fiction in the same universe. Now, let's talk about the quality of the PDF. The quality is good, however, I do have some criticisms. The first one is that there are no bookmarks. I think it would have been much better to have some bookmarks to move through the 3 comic books. It's not that big of a deal. That is, you only have 3 comic books in 84 pages, but bookmarks separating each of the comic books would have been quite handy. And I did notice that one of the pages repeats itself in the volume. I also noticed that at certain zoom levels, the dialogue balloons turn out slightly cropped. It's almost unnoticeable, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Now the rest, the quality is pretty good. You have a great use of colors, the shapes, the vibrancy of the tones. Everything works out so that it feels like a real universe, like real situations. Many times I saw the action scenes and I could almost feel like the characters were moving right before my eyes. I especially like, for example, in the case of the Blue Shift comic book, there are some moments where this superheroine starts to move about quite quickly. That's part of her personality, and the panels never feel like static images. The lettering and the dialogue balloons are quite easy on the eyes and they guide you through the panels. The use of the panels, the arrangement is also pretty good. It makes sense with the action. You never get confused as to what panel goes after which one. The entire composition feels quite fast-paced, and also it makes sense with the storyline as the plotline unfolds. I think that's one of the best things about this comic book, that all of the action scenes feel so organic, so action-packed, so high-paced. Everything feels moving and alive. Now let's talk about the contents. These 3 comic books feature British superheroes. You can see how in the Era the Empowered universe, there are heroes and villains in all sorts of shapes and colors and sizes. And here you have 3 heroes that I think are quite different from each other, especially considering the situations that they experience, and that adds a lot of flavor to the entire volume. Let's start with Lacuna Revelation. And don't worry, this review will not contain spoilers. I'm just going to talk a bit about the background of the heroes and the villains, but nothing related to plot twists and the climax of each of these stories. Lacuna is a teenager that suddenly found himself with this amazing teleportation power. He basically creates these portals and he can jump through them. He has a great sense of justice, so when he is aware of some wrongdoing or evil being done, he grabs a metal pipe and that's his entire thing. He doesn't even have a superhero outfit, he just puts on his hoodie, he takes his improvised weapon and he just starts jumping through those portals, arrives at the crime scene and stops the villains through brute force. However, he has 2 flaws that add a lot to the story. That is, these are personal issues and he's having a bit of trouble trying to sort them out or find a solution to them. First of all, his family situation is not exactly stable. His mother is gone. You don't know exactly what happened to his father, and he's living with his uncle. And because he goes out into the streets to fight crime, he suddenly gets injured and he doesn't spend his time in other activities that teenagers would normally do, preparing himself, learning new things. So he gets in some fights or arguments with his uncle. He oftentimes ends up injured during his many battles. So it's not a favorable situation when it comes to his development as a healthy teenager. His other flaw is that despite fighting all the time, he has no basic training in self-defense. He just tries to fight the best that he can, but because he has that aversion to learning and to taking care of himself, he's somewhat at a disadvantage. This story of Lacuna Revelation could be considered a sort of origin story, and at the same time, a quest for self-discovery. Eventually, Lacuna meets up with Penumbra. Penumbra is not exactly a hero, she's not a villain either. She could be considered an anti-hero. And she has taken a liking to Lacuna. She's trying to teach him the ropes, show him the ways of being empowered, of having these amazing superpowers. And she also helps him plan ahead as to what his objectives are as a superhero, or rather as a normal person that suddenly discovered that he had some very unusual abilities. One of the best parts of this comic book, if not the best, is when Lacuna ends up fighting a supervillain. So far he has been fighting thugs and just evildoers without powers, but he fights this Russian supervillain and he is very tough. He outclasses Lacuna in almost every way, most of all because he is an experienced villain that is quite proficient in some sort of fighting method. So Lacuna is going to have a very difficult time fighting this supervillain that I actually do not know too much about. His name is Igor. And this entire battle sequence is truly amazing in my opinion. I was almost at the edge of my seat. However, you will see one of the best examples of character growth in a trial by fire. A sort of character development that happens in an instant, where Lacuna starts to think about how he's going to use his powers in an intelligent way. He's not exactly like a powerhouse, he's more of a trickster type of hero with his teleportation ability. So you will see, if not the most original way of using the power, a somewhat cunning and practical use of his power that can take villains by surprise. Now, by the end of the comic book, I think things went quite smoothly and it made sense with the plotline, but I think the character of Lacuna is somewhat distorted by the end. You have this teenager that is sort of on the fringe side of things. He's not going to school. He's trying to find his own way in the world, trying to find some sort of alternate lifestyle. But by the end, I think the character of Lacuna had a very interesting direction with many conflicts, ready for some interesting developments. But by the end of things, it almost feels like they wrapped the thing in a very lukewarm sort of way, or a more acceptable type of style that, in my opinion, went against the fringe and the rebel characteristics of Lacuna as a superhero. Next, we have Blue Shift, Frenemies. Of the three comic books, this one I didn't like too much. Blue Shift features a superheroine that moves incredibly fast. You can see how she has many character flaws, but I think there is too much exposition in her flaws as a person. You see how she is somewhat of a pushover, and she's quite desperate in her search for love, and I think they put too much attention or emphasis on this romance subplot to the point that crime fighting almost feels like a side story, and I don't think that's a good thing for a superhero comic book. Although I do think that the lesbian romance problems that Blue Shift is experiencing is quite realistic. You can see her depression, that she never feels like truly satisfied in her quest for love. But when the comic book finally shifts to the crime fighting part, you see an interesting sort of coquettish or playful rivalry between the heroine Blue Shift and the villain, so to speak. In the case of Shira and her twin, they're kind of like teleporting twins that rob banks. They have a reason as to why they do it, but this obviously puts them at odds with Blue Shift. As to how Blue Shift interacts with the other characters in the comic book, I think she tries to be funny, but without going too overboard or too over the top. So I don't think you will end up laughing at her jokes, but you may end up smirking a bit. The fight scenes are quite amazing in this comic book as well. You see all the heroes and villains using their powers at their full potential, giving it their all to defeat their enemies, and the Necromancer actually makes an appearance here. He's probably my favorite supervillain of the Era the Empowered universe. When he and Blue Shift fight, it's truly amazing. They are both fighting with everything that they've got, and by the end of the comic book, you can see how Beth, that is Blue Shift's real name, still has a lot of problems and issues to deal with. So I actually really like the fights in this comic book, but I didn't like that they focused too much on the romance subplot. Not even in other comic books where there are famous like villains and heroes that have a thing for each other despite being on different sides. Their romances work into the crime fighting, but here I feel like the entire superhero aspect or supervillain aspect of the story is pushed to the side in favor of this romance. And I also consider this romance somewhat nonsensical because Blue Shift and She-Ra have only just met, and suddenly they are treating each other as if they have found the love of their lives, while there are obviously many issues between them, and not exactly those that generate chemistry between the heroine and the villainess. So I really disliked that part. There's also a confusing bit at the very end of the comic book that I don't really quite get between She-Ra's and Blue Shift's exchange that I think could have been clarified. Then we have Violet, Unstoppable. Violet is a very interesting superheroine. She is basically a cosplayer slash otaku, at least in the Western sense of the term, and she suddenly obtains these powers of super strength and flight. So now she is not only a performer, she is also embodying the powers of her costume. She has become a superheroine. She is not just a character that she admires. She fights criminals and does all sorts of good deeds. I actually noticed some parallels when comparing this story with Lacuna's comic book. While Lacuna's journey is a journey of self-discovery, you can see how Violet is undergoing a transformation of self-realization. She is more adapted to the whole superhero sort of lifestyle than Lacuna. You can see that fighting crime for her, it's almost a routine because she is quite powerful. She's like a weaker version of Superman in some ways. However, in this case, she is going to face off against an enemy that is up to her level, or perhaps even more if she doesn't fight in an intelligent way. There is this criminal by the name of Dane. It seems that he is really good at breaking out of prison. Because of some exchanges in her dialogue with Dane, you can see that Violet has captured him several times, who knows how many, and Dane always manages to escape, so that's pretty strange. However, Dane is going to undergo a transformation. The conflicts between Dane and Violet have been, so far, one-sided, but Dane will become the supervillain known as Rampage. Now, something that I really like of this comic book is how many things about Violet's lifestyle are revealed without getting in the way of the story, which is what I criticized of the Blue Shift comic book. Here you can see Violet's bedroom with all sorts of figurines and posters. You can see some Dragon Ball Z figures and a poster of Studio Ghibli, if I'm not mistaken. So you can see the sort of things that she likes. There's also an appearance of a very suspicious individual. They do not reveal who he is, but if you are familiar with the background of Ira the Empowered that appears in the core rulebook, maybe you have a good idea of who this character could be or who he works for. What faction does he belong to? When Violet fights Rampage, things become quite violent and bloody. Of the three comic books, I think that Violet's fight against Rampage is probably the most savage. And here you can see something that I would consider a weakness of this comic book. This particular adventure of Violet feels quite formulaic. You can see Violet following a certain structure. She identifies an almost unsurpassable obstacle or problem. She suffers and struggles while trying to solve this problem. She decides to look for a solution, and then the solution is found. And this is basically the entire story of Violet Unstoppable. You do have a small twist or something that you won't be able to predict in what Violet does to fight Rampage, but it was almost predictable in how Violet will tackle the situation. However, in some ways it also reveals many things about Violet. You can see how she is intellectually inclined. She is quite strategic, not so tactical from the start of the battle, but besides the battle against Rampage, you will also see how Violet interacts with other characters in the setting, and this adds a lot of believability in my opinion. What is quite nonsensical, however, is that there is a part in this comic book where Rampage is restrained by policemen. And this is absurd. Violet is very strong, and she has a lot of trouble when fighting Rampage. So I find it hard to believe that a couple of policemen are going to restrain this monster that is pretty much like a lizard man with camouflage capabilities, that is very strong. It is able to duke it out with Violet, who can punch through walls and steel. So policemen and a pair of handcuffs would never be able to restrain this monster. Even if he is injured, it makes no sense. However, I do like that by the end of this comic book, you can see how Violet's character cements itself with the world. The nature or essence of the character becomes somewhat different by the end. In the case of Lacuna, who I feel does some things out of character by the end, Violet stays true to herself through the entire story. Near the end of the comic book, you have character profiles, some character art with the entire biographies of each one of these, giving further details about the backgrounds of the different villains and heroes. So overall, what do I think of Era the Empowered Volume 1? I recommend it, but with a caveat or consideration. I think there's a pretty good chance that you will like 2 of the comic books in this collection more than the third one. And this doesn't necessarily mean that, for example, in my case, I didn't enjoy Blue Shift as much as Lacuna and Violet, but there could be some other people that actually like Blue Shift and, let's say, Violet, and they do not like the Lacuna Revelation story. So it all depends on your likes. I have given my opinion of what I do not like of Blue Shift, but let me clarify what I like and dislike of each of these comics. In Lacuna Revelation, I really like it that it's a sort of origin story, perhaps even a coming of age in superhero style, of Lacuna discovering more about his powers, trying to find a sense of direction, making a connection with Penumbra, trying to sort things out in his family life. But I do not like it that by the end, I feel like his choice by the end betrays some of his character, or what he represents, sort of like a rebel and living on the fringe almost. In the case of Blue Shift, I like the battles, and I like sort of the psychological issues, how they are represented in the case of the heroine of Blue Shift, but I do not like that they focused so much on the romance subplot, which basically becomes almost the entire plot of the story, in my opinion, and you have the crime fighting almost on the side. However, the awesome fights between Blue Shift and the villains save this comic book from becoming too dull. And in the case of Violet Unstoppable, I like the balance of showing some of Violet's personality, her likes, her hobbies, while at the same time facing off against this very powerful supervillain in the form of Rampage. I also like how they highlight her intellectual nature, but I do not like that illogical part where, as I said, Rampage gets restrained by a couple of policemen. They get him handcuffed, and that's in lizard form, in his monstrous form. I would understand it if they captured him while he was human, but now that he is such a powerful monster, it makes no sense. I also didn't like it that it follows a very specific formula. Like I said, the superhero finds this obstacle, goes through a very difficult time trying to overcome this obstacle. Then the superhero does some research or reassesses her strategies, and then she tackles the problem again. This has been seen too many times. However, I do like it that the Violet character, that is her personality, what she represents, actually becomes stronger or more firm as the story progresses. So with those things in mind, I recommend Era the Empowered Volume 1. With that consideration that maybe you will like 2 of the stories and one, I won't say not so much, but not as much as the others. My favorite is definitely the Lacuna Revelation story. It's unpredictable because Lacuna is so aimless in his purpose and dealing with all of those issues. You never know what's going to happen. Even his battle was quite unpredictable. So definitely check out Era the Empowered Volume 1. And if you play the Era the Empowered role-playing game, the stories of these 3 characters are going to give you a better grasp or better sense of the types of adventures that you could have in the setting of Era the Empowered. And maybe if, for example, the game master decides to introduce any of these characters into the adventure as non-player characters, You could gain more information on their personalities, on how your character was supposed to deal with them. Maybe they are famous in the way that the setting is portrayed in your particular campaign, so now you can know about these characters beforehand. More about them. You already have information about them in the core rulebook, but with these comics you get even more information about them. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.